January 6th, 1994. Today, for the first time, I met Nathan Wells, a 10-year-old boy who was brought by his parents. The family looked on the verge of a breakdown. The father was nervously fiddling with his tie, and the mother was struggling to hold back tears. They spoke almost in whispers, as if they were afraid that someone would overhear. "Doctor, we don't know what to do anymore," the father began, his voice trembling. "Nathan says that mirrors are alive, that they want to get out. He breaks mirrors, breaks furniture. He attacked his mother a few days ago." "He's not sleeping," her mother interrupted, her voice filled with despair. "At night, he just sits and stares at his reflection. Sometimes he talks to him." I looked at Nathan. The boy looked unusually calm. He had a pale face and dark circles under his eyes, but what struck me most was his gaze. He was empty, but at the same time wary, like a man who is constantly waiting for danger. Nathan sat motionless, as if afraid that any movement would awaken something invisible. "Nathan," I began, trying to speak softly. "Your parents told me that you are afraid of mirrors. Can you explain why?" The boy raised his head, but his eyes weren't looking at me. They were staring at the mirror behind me. "They want to get out," he said softly. "Who are they?" I asked, feeling a strange tension rise inside. "People from mirrors. They're hiding there. They're different." I tried to keep calm by writing down his words. "Why do you think they want to come out?" Nathan finally looked at me. His gaze was so cold that I had to suppress a shudder. "I saw it." "What exactly did you see?" "They were moving. In the mirror in the living room. They were looking at me. And then they started knocking." "Knock?" I asked, not hiding my surprise. "Yes. Quiet at first, then louder. I tried to tell my mom, but she said she couldn't hear anything." The boy looked down at his hands, which involuntarily began to clench into fists. "They want to take us away." He looked at me as if I had asked the stupidest of questions. "Because they need this world. Their world is dead, and now they want ours." These words were said with such confidence that I involuntarily looked away. "Are you afraid of them?" "No," he replied softly. "I'm not afraid. I'll stop them." "How?" He raised his head, and for the first time, something like emotion flashed in his eyes. "I'm going to smash their doors," he whispered, and then looked at the mirror behind me. The session ended after half an hour. My parents took Nathan home, and I stayed in the office, looking through my notes. His words sounded like childish nonsense, but there was a strange, frightening confidence in them. When I got up to turn off the light, it seemed to me that the mirror on the wall had darkened. For a moment, I saw something on its surface that looked like a faint palm print. I quickly turned away, deciding that I was just tired. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The boy's words kept ringing in my head. "Their world is dead. They want ours." January 10th, 1994. It's been a few days since I first met Nathan, and his parents have reached out to me again. Her mother called late at night. Her voice cracked, almost whispering, as if she was afraid of being overheard. She begged for an emergency appointment because the situation was out of control. "He broke all the mirrors in the house, doctor. That's it. I smashed it with my bare hands." Her voice was shaking. "And today, he hit his father." She started crying, unable to finish, and I heard my father pick up the phone. His voice was harsh, but there was fear in it too. "He's become dangerous, doctor. Not only for yourself, but also for us. You have to help." An hour later, the family was in my office. Nathan looked even more haggard. His hands were bandaged, but I noticed bloodstains seeping through the fabric. The mother looked at her son with horror all the time. The father stood behind her, as if preparing to intervene at any moment. "Doctor, he doesn't even sleep at night," the mother said, her eyes full of tears. "I can hear him whispering in his room, and when we enter, he looks at the wall as if there is something there." "It's them," Nathan interrupted sharply, without looking up. His voice was unexpectedly loud. I made a gesture for the parents to give me time to talk to the boy alone. At first they hesitated, but then they went out, leaving us alone in the office. "Nathan," I began cautiously, "can you tell me what's going on?" He raised his head. He had the same cold, fixed look on his face that I remembered from our first meeting. "They come at night," he said, as if he were talking about something completely ordinary. "They think I can't see them, but I can." "Who are they?" I asked. "People from mirrors. They know that I broke down their doors. Now they're trying to find another one." "Another door?" I asked again. "Yes, in my mother's jewelry, in the glass of the clock, in puddles on the street. They penetrate wherever they can see a reflection." I wrote down his words, feeling a heaviness rise inside. "Can you hear them?" He nodded, and for the first time his face twitched. "They tell me it's my fault, that I stopped them, but not for long." I noticed that his fingers were clenching into fists again. "What are they saying?" He looked up at me, and there was something frightening in his gaze. "They're whispering. We'll be back. We'll find you. We'll find everyone." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you afraid of them, Nathan?" He replied with frightening certainty. "They should be afraid of me." That was the end of our meeting, but on his way out, Nathan stopped by the mirror in the hallway. He stared at his reflection for so long that the orderly standing next to him touched his shoulder. "It's not me," he whispered, and there was so much pain in his voice that I felt something heavy clench inside. "What do you mean?" I asked, coming closer. "They wear our faces," he replied, without taking his eyes off the mirror. "But it's not us." When Nathan left with his parents, I was left alone in the office. I was sitting at my desk, looking at my notes, trying to make sense of everything I had heard. His words sounded like the fruit of a wild fantasy, but they had a strange, frightening logic. Later, at home, I opened the bathroom cupboard to get some medicine for insomnia, and stopped. My reflection in the mirror looked different. I can't explain what exactly, but there was something unnatural about him. I looked more closely, but I didn't notice anything. When I turned off the light, it seemed to me that something moved in the darkness, but maybe it was just my fatigue. January 13th, 1994. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Nathan's mother called me. Her voice was trembling. She spoke haltingly, almost shouting. "The doctor, he attacked me. Please come." I heard the sounds of sobbing on the phone, and then the voice of Nathan's father, demanding that the police be called immediately. I hurried to their house, even though my mind was resisting. What can I do in the middle of the night? When I entered the house, everything looked different than when we first met. The living room was dimly lit by a lamp, but the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. The floor was strewn with glass fragments that crunched underfoot. There was a broken mirror in the corner, its frame twisted as if it had been violently ripped out of the wall. Nathan was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. His face was stained with blood, his fingers were clutching a mirror fragment, and his gaze was detached. There were bloodstains on his shirt. My father was standing next to my mother, who was clutching her neck, which was covered with a cloth. He tried to cut my throat," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The father pointed at the boy. He said it wasn't his mother, that it was someone else. I approached Nathan slowly so as not to frighten him. "Nathan," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "It's your mom." "Why did you do that?" The boy looked up at me, and I immediately realized that it was not an ordinary childish look. There was no remorse or anger in him, just cold confidence. "It's not her," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "She was standing by the mirror. They took her away. She's not real anymore." "Who are they?" he replied, as if it were obvious. I crouched down to be at eye level with him. "What makes you think she's not real?" He leaned closer and whispered so softly that I could barely hear. "Her eyes aren't moving, doctor. They are empty." I looked at my mother, who was still standing in the corner. Her eyes were red from crying, and her face was pale, but I didn't notice anything strange. However, Nathan's words kept ringing in my head. "I should have stopped her," he added. I couldn't continue the conversation. His parents insisted that I immediately take the boy to the clinic, where he would be under observation. When I took him away, he sat in silence, but before leaving the house, he glanced at his mother and whispered, "It's still not her." Later that night, when I got home, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. Its surface was covered with condensation, but I suddenly realized that I didn't want to wipe it off. It was scary to see my reflection. January 20th, 1994. Today, Nathan was transferred to a closed psychiatric clinic. His parents could no longer cope with the boy's seizures, which were becoming more and more dangerous. After the nighttime attack, they insisted on immediate intervention, although the mother seemed to hesitate to the last, as if she was afraid that the decision would turn into something terrible. The clinic where he was transferred was located in an old building on the outskirts of the city. The high walls, narrow corridors, and dim lighting created a depressing atmosphere. There was always silence here, broken only by the occasional moan of patients. In such conditions, even professionals felt anxious, and for a child this place could become a trap. When I arrived to check on his adaptation, Nathan was already seated in the ward. The room was small, furnished with the most basic necessities: a bed, a table, a chair, and a window with a grate. There were no mirrors on the walls, a mandatory rule for patients with his diagnosis, but it didn't look reassuring to the boy. "Doctor," he said as soon as I entered. His voice sounded strange, as if he had been waiting for me for a long time. "How are you feeling, Nathan?" "There are doors here too," he whispered, looking at the window. "Which doors?" He slowly turned his head, and his eyes seemed to be boring into me. "Glass. It reflects. They'll find a way." I sat down next to him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Nathan, you're safe here. No one can harm you." He laughed. That laugh was quiet, but it made me feel cold. "They don't mean any harm, doctor. They just want to live." "Live where?" "Here. In us." His words sounded like madness, but there was something terribly meaningful in them. I could feel his voice echoing in my head. "What do you mean?" He got up from the bed and went to the window. I followed him. "They're waiting for the moment. In the reflections. They're watching. Sometimes they don't blink the way you do. Sometimes they smile when you're serious. It's all of them. They're trying us out." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Nathan, have you seen them here?" He turned to me and whispered, "They're already here." These words, spoken so softly, as if he wasn't talking to me, but to himself, made me involuntarily look around. There was only a corridor with a soft light behind me, but it seemed to me that there was something dark, like movement at the far end. Later, returning home, I felt strange. The whole day in the clinic was under heavy pressure. Every time I passed by windows or glass surfaces, it seemed to me that something was changing there. It was as if the reflection in them had a life of its own, no matter what I did. But the worst thing happened in the evening. Already lying in bed, I heard a soft creaking sound in the bedroom, as if someone was slowly running his nails over the glass. I knew it was impossible. There were no mirrors in my room. But when I raised my head, I saw a faint glimmer in the darkness opposite the window. It looked like a shadow had shot up. January 30th, 1994. Everything that had been happening in recent weeks seemed to have reached its climax. Tonight, everything was revealed. The truth that I didn't want to know, and the horror that will now haunt me for the rest of my life. I arrived at the clinic early in the morning, prompted by an urgent call. Nathan threw what the staff called a tantrum, but there was more than just concern in their voices. When I entered his room, I immediately felt cold, as if the air was saturated with something alien. Nathan was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring out the window. His hands were covered in blood, his face was stained, and the bandages on his fingers were torn again. It scratched at the barred glass, leaving thin streaks that strangely resembled patterns. The doctors stood at a distance. No one wanted to come closer. "Nathan," I began cautiously. "What happened?" He turned around, and there was a strange smile on his face. Not childish, but not maniacal either. Something terrible flashed in his eyes, as if he already knew what was about to happen. "They're not coming," he said calmly. "Who?" "People from mirrors. It's not their fault." "What do you mean?" He got to his feet, staggered, and came over to me. His eyes, deep and bottomless, bored into mine. "That's him. All this time." "Who?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Dad." I couldn't answer because at that moment I heard screams from the hallway. One of the paramedics burst into the room. His face was white, as if he had seen a ghost. "We found this in the boys' things," he said, handing me an old photograph. The picture showed Nathan, about 8 years old, naked, and his father. But there was something terrible about this image. The father's hand was firmly holding the boy's shoulder, and the look with which he looked at the camera was full. The authorities? Cruelty? I can't describe it. I turned to Nathan. "Is that him? Did he hurt you?" The boy was silent, his eyes filled with tears. "I stole this picture and put it in my pants pocket. You found her. He said no one would know," he whispered. "But everyone saw the mirrors. They remember everything." I felt my knees tremble. The boy continued to speak. His voice was low, but the words sounded like thunder. "When he came to my room, the mirrors were looking. I saw their eyes. They tried to stop him, but they couldn't. His body was shaking, and at that moment I realized that everything he was describing was not nonsense. It was his way of dealing with terror." "Did you smash them so they wouldn't see?" Nathan nodded, his face contorted with pain. "I didn't want them to watch anymore." I felt a cold sweat run down my back. Everything worked out. His fear of reflections, his aggression, his belief that mirrors open doors. They really saw too much. I left the room, leaving him with the doctors. Millions of thoughts were spinning in his head, but one stood out especially vividly. His father was a real monster. Later, I found out that Nathan's father had committed suicide. When I got home, I closed all the mirrors in my apartment. But at night, in the dark, it seemed to me that there was a faint glimmer in the corner of the window. Eyes that remember everything.